Shalom, everybody, and good Chodesh. Happy new month of Sivan. We're learning in chapter 39. This is a small chapter, but it's a little bit of a tricky one because we're talking about food we're eating before the meal. Do you have to say a bracha achrona and then a new bracha for the meal, or do you just go right into the meal? What if you forgot? What do you do? Okay. So now another point that the Shulchan Aruch makes is sometimes you're going to eat food before the meal, but the purpose of that food is to stimulate the appetite. Appetizers, I think the even word appetizers says to stimulate the appetite. I've never really needed that. I somehow seem to always have an appetite. But apparently there is food that one eats to stimulate one's appetite. So according to those who say that if the purpose of that food is to stimulate the appetite, well then that would be kind of considered part of the meal and wouldn't require its own after blessing, bracha achrona. Others say that this factor about stimulating appetite does not connect with it doesn't connect it with the food that you're going to eat after, with the meal, in regards to the obligation to say a bracha achrona for that food. And so the subject of this sif is wine, which we mentioned last time as a way of getting people's minds stimulated on the subject. Now we're going to talk about its potential stimulating impact onto your meal. You want to drink some wine before the meal. And Natil Yadayim specifically is when you wash for bread before the meal. Even if you're not going to drink wine during the meal, you're just going to have a little bit of wine before the meal. Nonetheless, there are those who say, wine is just a digestive opening. Just to make sure a person has a desire to eat a meal. It's part of the meal. So therefore, it's the first part of the meal. And when you say Birkat Hamazon at the end of your meal, so you've exempted that wine that you had before the meal, and you didn't have to say a separate bracha achrona for that wine. There are those who say, no, it says, even if you will drink wine during the meal, right? The first case is the person's only drinking wine before the meal. Now you're going to drink wine even during the meal. Mikol makom, nonetheless, wine that you drink before the meal is not going to exempt you from a bracha achrona when you say the Birkat Hamazon after your meal. So according to this view, the fact that the food serves as an appetizer to open up the appetite doesn't make it part of the meal. The Mishnah Berurah notes that since wine requires a bracha rishona when you drink it during a meal, okay, right, because it's a special food, wine. If one is planning to drink wine during the meal, he doesn't have to say a bracha achrona on that wine that he drank before the meal, right? So, and that's going to be our generally held practice today. If you are going someplace for dinner, right? But can anybody think about the most, we do that every time we have a Friday night dinner, right? We say borei pirgafen, and then we drink some wine, and then we say amotzi. Nobody says a separate bracha. Now, it is a little bit different because it's a Friday night, and the whole process of the wine serves it's not just an, potential of a opening up of our appetite, like anyone needs that on a Friday night, but it also serves to perform a mitzvah. So it's obviously it's a little bit different, but you see, we do that every week. Okay. But let's say you're just having a random Memorial Day barbecue and you're having some wine before the meal. So then you would say the bracha achrona, birkat hamazon, would cover the wine you had before. If you had wine during the meal, if you only had wine before the meal, Mishnah Berurah would say, you should say a bracha achrona before you say the benching. Before you say the hamotzi. Lchaim. Now, this is the Kitzer is going to step in. We're going to go back to the Kitzer. That was the Mishnah Berurah. We're going back to the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch and get his take on this. Lchaim yesh limnoya milishtois kodem diyazina. So he says, no, because of this doubt that you've gotten yourself in, whether you should or shouldn't say a bracha achrona after the wine before a meal, lo yishte, shouldn't have. Elim ken yishte kois yain gam lachar birkat hamazon, unless you're drinking a cup of wine after birkat hamazon, which we'll explain about. Shivarech acharei v'gefen. So there is a custom that when you do benching, when you say the birkat hamazon with a group of 3 or more, you say the blessing over a glass of wine, and then you're going to bring yourself to say the ala gefen blessing, the after blessing over wine, because you did this after the meal, and you have a separate bracha achrona there, and that's going to cover the doubt, potential doubt, whether you should have done one before the meal. It's going to exempt what you drank before Netilas Yadayim, before the meal. Now, the Kitzer advises this course of action with the wine that one drinks for Kiddush as well. So he says, no, the wine you had for Kiddush requires a bracha achrona. Okay. And so he would say you should bench Shabbos on a kos, on a cup of wine. In other words, you should say the Rabosai Nevarech, that whole part afterwards on a cup of wine. The Bir Halacha writes that in a case where you did drink wine before the meal, and now you have created that safek, that uncertain obligation, or let's say there's several opinions, right? Whether you should say bracha achrona on the wine, such as when drinking wine for Kiddush and Shabbos, they should specifically have in mind that birkat hamazon recites that they recited the Kiddush meal applies to the wine they drank before the meal. In other words, Berlacha says there's an easier way out of this. Just have in mind the wine you had before. Okay. Because we know that if you have wine during the meal, it would exempt when you said the birkat hamazon. So have in mind the wine you had before the meal. Okay. Now, that covers the wine. What if we have something other than wine before the meal? Let's say you want to have some liquor. Yain saref is like whiskey, liquor, something, vodka, something strong before the meal. Whether you're going to have some during the meal, or you're not going to have any during the meal. Now, there's a different bracha obligation, right, on the wine than on the vodka, right? The wine has a special blessing, the ala gefen blessing, after blessing. The whiskey or the wine, or could even beer, is also, it's not considered liquor, but same has a shehakol blessing after it, right? Shehakol nibivro. Yizaher, a person should be careful, says the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch. Don't drink before the meal an amount which would oblige you to say bracha achrona, only a little bit, to less than a kazayis, to open up your appetite. A bracha achrona is recited, right, when you have to have a certain amount, right? So if you had a taste of wine, everybody would say there's no bracha achrona because you didn't have a minimum amount to say the blessing. You have to have a minimum amount to say the blessing achrona. Later in the Kitzur, we're going to discuss the minimum amount.
Like a kazayas.
Yes, kazayas, exactly. And we're going to discuss later a little bit what that's going to be in chapter 51. We'll get into the discussion of what constitutes a kazayas. But we know that just a sip of the whiskey or the wine or whatever you're having, that just a sip is never going to be a kazayas. Is not going to be a kazayas by definition. So you don't get yourself in a situation. You only have to say a blessing before it, not after it. Aval im shasa kazayis o yoser nafal liyadei safek bracha achrona. But you had more than that. Now you've got this situation of halachic doubt regarding whether you need to say a bracha achrona, like in the beginning of the discussion. Now, in that case, safek bracha lahakel, when we don't know whether we should say a bracha or not, we are lenient, i.e., we do not recite a bracha achrona because we don't want to say a bracha levatala, a blessing in vain. Number 24. Number 24. Number 3, chapter 39. Okay. Let's say you want to have some mazonos food before the meal. Now it's really starting to sound like a good Kiddush. Kegoin, Henig, Kichen, honey cake, Eire Kichen, egg kichel, the like. You have a michya, right? Shebracha achrona shalem al michya. Bein shechalem gam mesechasuda. Whether you're going to eat some of this honey cake during the meal or not. Bein shelechal me'am mesechasuda. Mikol makom. In those cases, hein niftarim birchas. Those, the mazonos you have, that is covered by the bracha achrona of the birkat hamazon. He says the cake you had before the meal is covered by your birkat hamazon at the end of the meal. Ubilvad, provided shelo yafsik harbe ben achila. You don't have, as long as there's not a big break between your honey cake or kichel or your crackers before the meal and when you washed for the meal. But if there was a lengthy interruption, first you have to say a bracha achrona on the crackers or the cake, even if you're going to have them during the meal, right? If you have such a big break, then it's its own thing. But if you have them and then you go into the meal, now what's going to constitute that break? And a few other details. We have another few moments here. We're going to discuss that. So, let's say, first of all, you did say birkat hamazon after eating mazonos. Okay, right? Instead of saying the alamichia bracha, which is what we say after mazonos, after cake, the threefold blessing, it's called, right? I mean, the threefold, but al-michya has 3 options, right? It has the al-michya, val-gefen, val-pirot, just 3 different options. Let's say you said the whole birkat hamazon after ala cake, you would be okay. You'd fulfill your obligation to say an after blessing. In cases where the recitation of birkat will be used to exempt the doubtful ala michya, you should have in mind with regard to mazonos that you'd eaten before. Now, the Mishnah Berurah also says that there are certain cases when you eat mazonos before a meal, but not during the meal, where it's preferable to say al mechiyah immediately. You have to go to, and the Igros Moshe or Lchaim writes similarly, that in certain cases, you should say the al mechiyah on the mazonos, snack before the meal. Igros Moshe has an extensive treatment of these halachas. Now, regarding the obligation of a bracha achrona and the common case of eating cake before the meal after citing Kiddush on Shabbos day, you have to wait to chapter 77, right? You go to Shul, you have a little Kiddush, you have a piece of mazonos, now you're going to sit for the meal. Do you sit? Do you say the bracha achrona first or not? Now, how long is that break going to be? Here he doesn't discuss it, but generally, our thinking is I think it's going to be more than an hour break. You want to say a bracha achrona and then say the blessing on the separate blessing on the hamotzi, or if you went to a new location, that also could do it. And in all these cases, if you do have a doubt about whether to say the blessing, the after blessing on a cake, if there's a doubt, you can always roll that into the Birkat Hamazon, and that way, because then Safek Brach Lahakel, in a doubtful situation, we're going to avoid saying the extra blessings. Okay, that's chapter 39 is a wrap. Everybody have a awesome day.